Hey guys, this is Justin and I'm going to show you how to change out the fork sills on your Suzuki DR650. So if you own a DR650 or any motorcycle for that matter, you're going to have fork sills that leak eventually. There's a few things that cause them to leak. Sometimes just sitting around, being old, the sills wear out and they'll start leaking. Sometimes you'll get a nick in your fork tube and that wears out the sill, and I'll show you how to inspect that in a minute. But most of the time, sills just get dirt in them and they start to leak. So I'm going to show you how to change those out, and if you learn to change them out on your own, you're going to be able to save yourself a lot of money in the long run, because again, fork sills leak. So it's just part of normal motorcycle maintenance. So let's get to it. All right, so to do this job right, there's a few common hand tools we're going to need, a couple specialty tools, rags, some gloves, safety glasses of course. A heat gun isn't a bad idea. And then we're going to need some fork oil. 10 weight oil is going to work for this bike. Some cleaner of some sort. I have Maxima suspension clean, but you can use contact cleaner. And then some fork seals and dust seals. And we sell a variety of different seals. I'm probably going to use the Race Tech for this video. Grease is a good idea, and potentially you may need some new bushings, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. All right, so now that we have everything, we're ready to disassemble these forks. Now, before you take the fork completely off the bike, it's a good idea to loosen the cap. It's going to make it a lot easier to remove that when it's already off the bike. So to get started, I'm going to remove the fork boot and make sure the fork is totally clean. So I'm going to use my Phillips screwdriver, loosen the clamps on the fork boot here. And then once those are loosened up on the top and bottom, I'll just slide it right off. Set that aside. Now with my clean rag, I'm going to clean this thing up. As you can see, there's a lot of sand and oil, dirt inside this fork. With the fork cleaned up, I want to remove this retaining ring. This is sitting right on top of the dust seal, and under the dust seal is the oil seal. So we got to get this out of the way. And then you can just spread it and take it off. Now we can remove the cap. This is a 22 millimeter wrench. And as we're loosening this and we get kind of toward the end of the threads, we kind of want to hold the cap down a little bit because there is a little bit of pressure from the spring. So we have the cap, big steel spacer, and then a washer that sits right on top of the spring. So I'm going to set those aside on my clean rag and then pull the spring out. All right, with the spring removed, we can dump the oil. And it's not a bad idea to pump the fork a couple times to get as much oil out as you can. You're not going to get it all out. So with the oil drained as much as we can get it, now we have to remove the bolt from the bottom of the fork. And before I do that, I want to show you how that's kind of hooked together. This damping rod is inside the fork, and the bolt on the bottom actually threads into this. So if you just put your wrench on there and start loosening it, this is just going to spin inside and you're not going to get it apart. So you need this tool to hold the damping rod, and it's an inexpensive tool, and it just goes down inside the fork and fits in to the damping rod just like that and holds it still so you can get that bolt out. Now, one thing to pay attention to when you use this tool is you want to keep it as straight as possible. You don't want it rocking inside that damping rod and ruin that if it slips or something. So you want to hold that as straight as you can. All right, to make this easier, I'm going to put the fork in a vise and use the Tusk damping rod tool to go down inside the fork, and I can feel that lock into place nice. And then using my 8 millimeter Allen and ratchet and loosen that up. And as you can see, if I didn't have that tool, the cartridge would just spin. So definitely a tool worth investing in. All right, once the bolt is loose, we can take that out, and you'll notice there's a little copper washer on the bottom. We'll set that aside, remove our tool, and then with the fork out of the vise, I'm gonna tip it upside down, and I'm gonna make a mess. But you can see I've got the damping rod, the little rebound spring in there, and I'm gonna set that aside. Now there's also a little plastic bushing in there that sometimes likes to stay in there, but we'll get that out in a minute. We just want to make sure it's there and that we put it in right when we assemble the fork. So with the damping rod out, the clip off the top of the sill, we're ready to pull this fork apart and expose the fork sills. So to do that, we're going to extend the fork tube, and then we're going to slide and hit the two bushings against each other to knock the sill out. Now, it's a good idea to use a heat gun right here to help the fork sill that's stuck in this tube just loosen up and come out a little bit easier. So I'm going to heat it up a little bit, and then I'll kind of slide hammer this apart. Now that I'm warmed up a bit, give it a few hits, and there you go. Now real quick, the reason why the heat gun is a good idea is because when you're pounding that apart, you have your inner bushing and outer bushing hitting against each other. And if that seal is really stuck inside the fork tube, then you'll end up hitting these really hard against each other, and you can sometimes ruin them, and you'll be forced to replace them. So with the fork apart, I'm gonna set this aside and let some more oil run out of it. And then with the inner tube, I'm going to remove the dust seal and the oil seal. Then you have a washer here as well that sits underneath. And now this is a good time to inspect your bushings and your fork tube. So your bushings, this is what your fork, inner and outer tube, are sliding against. So you want to inspect it and make sure the Teflon coating is in good shape. If you see any kind of scratches through it, the Teflon coating rubbing off, you definitely want to replace these, or you'll be changing fork seals again really quick. So there's that one. You can inspect this one as well. These are both in really good shape. Now, while this is all apart, I mentioned that nicks in your fork tube can cause the seals to leak. So we want to inspect that while we have everything apart. So clean the fork tube really well, and then just kind of run your fingers along the chrome plating and look for any kind of dings. Now, if you do come across a little ding or scratch, you'll want to take a small file or, really high grit, like 1,000 grit sandpaper, and try to buff that out. Because if you have a little tiny sharp edge, it's just going to eat through your new seal. Where this bike has fork boots on it, it's pretty well protected, and it looks like it's in good shape. So I feel confident in just putting that back together. So at this point, we just want to make sure everything is really clean. And I want to point out, if your bushings are wore out, we sell OEM ones, but we also sell a kit from All Balls, and that kit's pretty nice because it comes with the bushings, it comes with new copper washers for the bottom of the fork, new retaining clips on top of the seal, so it comes with a few things. It's a nice little kit. So we'll get the inner tube all clean, and it's not a bad idea to set it somewhere and let it sit for a bit so whatever oil is left in it can drain out. All right, now we can clean the outer tube, and there's that plastic piece I mentioned earlier. You want to watch for that. It sometimes gets stuck in the bottom or sometimes stuck in here, but that piece just fits right onto the bottom of the damping rod, and it can only go on one way. Can't go on both ways, so it's pretty easy to figure out how it goes on. Just make sure you have that, and then clean the outer tube really well, especially where these seals go, because that's usually where the dirt is. Once the outer tube's clean, we can start assembling the fork by reinstalling the bushing, the washer, and the seals. So we'll go ahead and do that. So I'm going to take the inner tube and carefully put it in the vise. I have soft jaws and a rag, and I'm just putting this in there not very tight at all. Now I can reinstall the bushing, the washer. Now when I install the sills, there's a couple things I want to point out. This sill bullet from Motion Pro is a really nice thing to have because it protects your sill from any sharp edge that may be on the top of this tube. Another important thing to point out when you're putting the sills on is you want to use some grease. So I'm using some suspension grease here. You know, bearing grease is going to be fine. You just want to make sure you grease that sill. And it's also important to note that the numbers on the outside of the sill, that's going to go away from the oil. So in this case, I'm going to point that upwards. I'm just going to slide that right over the sill bullet and onto the tube and down. And then next is the dust seal. And same thing, you want to grease it up and then slide it over and down. Now another thing I like to do is put a little bit of grease on the outside of the seal and dust seal. Again, if you ever have to take apart this fork and you're sliding the fork apart, that seal is going to come out a lot easier if you had pre-greased it. So with that in place, I'm going to take off the sill bullet, and now we're going to start assembling the fork. So making sure that the damping rod is clean, I'm going to put on the little spring there, and I'm going to put it back into the inner tube. So I'm just going to slide it down carefully, then reach your finger up in to kind of guide it out of the bottom. Then with that little plastic piece, you're going to make sure that fits on the end of the damping rod. Then we can get the outer tube, slide it into place, and then again, make sure you're lined up down at the bottom, and then you can get your bolt, and with a little bit of low strength thread locker on there, you can thread that back into the damping rod. All right, so with the bolt started, I'm going to go ahead and set this back into the vise so we can drive the seal and the dust seal into place. Now to get those into place, we are going to use a seal driver, and these things make getting the seal in so much easier. They're worth their weight in gold. So I'm just going to set this on top of the inner tube with the seal driver in place. I'm just going to give it a few hits. And you can kind of feel when that seal seats all the way down. And when it's down, I'm going to slide the dust seal down and do the same thing. All right, once the dust seal is in place, we can go ahead and put on the retaining clip. I'm going to slide that over the top, and then we're just going to kind of squeeze it together and push it down inside. And you'll kind of be able to see it fit into the grooves. I like to use the seal driver and just kind of push down on it to make sure it pops into place. And then visually inspect it to make sure it's in the groove. So that looks good. With everything in place, I'm going to flip this fork around back in the vise like this so I can torque the bolt in the damping rod. I'm going to use my damping rod tool, put that into place, and then tighten this in, and once I get it somewhat tight, I'll throw the torque wrench on it. Now this should be torqued to about 21.5 foot-pounds. So the manual says that this thing takes 565 cc's, so I'm going to measure that and put it in. Another way you can measure the fork oil is it calls for 165 millimeters of distance from the top to the top of the oil. So if you want to do it that way, you can use this tool. You set it at 165 millimeters, put it in, and you suck out any excess oil. But where I have the measurement, I've cleaned the fork out really well. I'm just going to go with the 565 milliliters or cc's right now. So I'm going to use my Bel-Ray 10 weight oil. And since this ratio right only goes to 500, I'm going to pour in 400 and then I'll pour in another 165 milliliters. So now keep in mind, if you're going to measure the oil height using this tool, you'll want to pump the fork several times to get that oil circulated and all through the damper inside. Since I'm just doing oil volume and the oil's low enough, I'm going to go ahead and put in my spring. Then I'm going to lift up my inner tube. Then I can put in the washer right on top of the spring, the spacer, and finally the cap. You're going to have to push that down and compress the spring a little, twist that inner tube to get it started. Then using the wrench, put it the rest of the way on. Now all we have to do is put the fork boot on. And these fork boots do wear out over time. So keep in mind we have a few options for those. Of course we have the OEM, but we also have some aftermarket options if your fork boots are a little thrashed. Now with the fork boot in place, I'm going to wait to tighten the clamps when I get it in the motorcycle. Once I get the pinch bolts tight, the wheel in place, and that fork boot resting where it wants to rest, I'll tighten those up. But anyway, that's it. That's how you rebuild the fork sills on your DR650. Keep in mind, it's important to always refer to your service manual for technical information, torque specs. For the most part, any conventional fork like this, the process is pretty much the same. But again, refer to your service manual. If you like this video and it helped you out, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Keep in mind we have a lot of other how-to videos, bike builds, and product spotlights. Thanks for watching.